In the ancient Ural Mountains, which hold countless secrets, lie giant megalithic complexes that mainstream science stubbornly dismisses as bizarre tricks of nature. These enormous stone blocks, arranged into walls and strange structures, surpass even the famous trilithons of Baalbek in their size and mass. If they were recognized as man-made, they would instantly become the oldest and largest megaliths on the planet, rewriting all of known history. But the academic world prefers to see them merely as geological formations, the result of wind and erosion. However, today we will talk about a structure that makes the word nature impossible to say. We will discuss something that can no longer be dismissed as chance. Something that stands as undeniable proof of intelligent will and incredible skill. In a remote Ural village stands a wall that defies everything we know about the region's past. This is not just a pile of rocks. It is a monumental structure made of massive granite blocks, assembled into complex polygonal masonry without a single ounce of mortar. This is exactly how the most mysterious ancient civilizations built, using technologies that remain an unsolved puzzle for us to this day. The irregularly shaped stones are fitted together with such jeweler-like precision that a knife blade cannot be slipped between them. And most astonishingly, for miles around there isn't a single granite quarry or even a natural outcrop of this rock. This means only one thing. Every multi-ton block was brought here from far away. From this point, simple explanations end, and a territory of unsettling questions begins. Who possessed the technology not only to process granite with laser-like precision, but also to transport these colossal blocks over vast distances and difficult terrain? For what purpose was this cyclopean structure erected in the Ural wilderness, far from all known centers of ancient cultures? How old is it really, if its appearance and the erosion of the stone suggest an age of perhaps thousands of years? And the main question, which adds a hint of conspiracy to this story: why did this unique site remain virtually unknown to the public until 2014, as if its existence was deliberately hidden from view? Today, we will try to lift the veil on this mystery. The story of this incredible structure, hidden for centuries in the Ural wilderness, was reborn in December 2014. It was then that a documentary film, produced by the Travelers Club Planet's Heritage, titled The Chusavoya Miracle: Polygonal Masonry in the Urals, caused a sensation online. The effect was stunning. The forgotten village of Chusavoya in the Middle Urals suddenly found itself at the epicenter of heated debates, and the search term polygonal masonry in the Urals shot to the top of internet trends. The film went viral, especially among those interested in ancient mysteries and alternative history. It showed an expedition of researchers who traveled to Chusavoya, following vague rumors of a strange megalithic object. The film's footage captured their journey through dense thickets and, finally, the moment of discovery. Before them stood a gigantic stone wall, partially submerged in the earth and hidden by a centuries-old layer of forest debris. One of the expedition members later described his feelings as the awe of a discoverer standing on the threshold of a great mystery, one capable of overturning all academic notions of the past. It was the feeling of touching something that would force historians to admit that highly developed civilizations, of which we have no knowledge, existed on the territory of modern Russia in deep antiquity. A bold statement, but what they found gave every reason for it. The wall stretches for about 85 meters in length and rises up to 4 meters in height. It is built from massive, multifaceted granite blocks, each weighing several tons. Some giant stones are more than 2 meters long and 1.5 meters high. But the main thing is not their size, but the method of construction. It is a complex polygonal masonry, where each irregularly shaped block is fitted to its neighbors with incomprehensible precision, like pieces of a giant three-dimensional puzzle. There is not the slightest gap between the stones, nor are there any traces of mortar. This technology instantly brings to mind the most mysterious structures on the planet. The resemblance to the walls of ancient complexes in Peru's Machu Picchu and Sacsayhuaman, or the megaliths of Bolivia's Tiwanaku and Egypt's Osirion, is striking. Moreover, on closer inspection, the Ural wall even revealed the same characteristic inserts, small, intricately shaped stones perfectly fitted into the masonry. Such design elements are found only in the most complex and mysterious ancient constructions around the world, from the Ahu-Vinapu wall on the remote Easter Island to the megalithic foundations of Osaka Castle in Japan. Is this just a series of incredible coincidences? Or are we seeing direct proof of a single, global, prehistoric civilization that possessed universal building knowledge? The wall in Chusavoye doesn't just stand. It was engineered with the landscape in mind. It follows the curve of a ravine and has a slight incline, indicating its function as a retaining wall, designed to withstand hydraulic pressure or soil erosion. This is not a chaotic pile, but a complex engineering structure that required serious calculations. At first glance, it seems impossible, but historians had a simple explanation, or so they thought. Against the backdrop of these mind-boggling comparisons to the world's greatest mysteries, official history offered a much more mundane and, at first glance, perfectly logical explanation. According to the established version, there is no prehistoric secret in Chusavoye. The wall is merely part of a hydraulic engineering system, specifically a pier or retaining wall built in the 1720s for a cast iron and ironworks factory founded by the famous Demidov industrialists. This version immediately transports us from a world of myths and lost technologies to the understandable and well-documented era of Russia's intense industrial development in the Urals. The Demidov name was renowned throughout the Russian Empire at that time. They were enterprising and incredibly wealthy industrialists who, by decree of Peter the Great, were turning the Urals into the country's main metallurgical center. They built factories, dams, developed mines, and constructed roads. In this paradigm, the construction of a large-scale engineering structure looks not like a miracle, but as a logical stage of industrial development. In those days, the Chusavoye River was not just a river, but a vital transport artery, a veritable lifeline for the Ural factories. It was along this river, during the spring high water, that the entire year's production of cast iron and iron was floated on huge wooden barges to central Russia. Therefore, a strong, reliable, and durable pier was not a luxury, but an urgent production necessity. It had to withstand the force of the spring ice flows and the constant load of docking and loading barges. According to this theory, the construction was carried out by assigned peasants and hired laborers under the direction of one of the Demidov managers, reportedly named Zotov. One can immediately imagine a picture of titanic yet entirely human labor. Hundreds of men using the simplest tools, picks, crowbars, wedges, quarry stone nearby. Then, most likely in winter, the blocks are transported to the construction site on dozens of horse-drawn sleds. On site, using a system of wooden levers, log platforms, earthen ramps, and incredible human strength, the stones are set in place one by one. Yes, the work was colossal, requiring enormous resources and time. But for the Demidovs, who controlled millions and the fates of thousands, it was a feasible task. Within this version, the polygonal masonry is explained not by some lost knowledge, but by harsh practicality. Instead of spending time and effort to shape the stones into standard rectangular blocks, the workers simply used the boulders as they were quarried, only minimally hewing the edges for a better fit. This saved time and resources, which was crucial in the context of rapid industrial construction. Thus, the mysterious wall is transformed from a legacy of ancient civilizations into an outstanding but entirely explainable monument of Russian industrial architecture of the early 18th century. It is a testament not to alien technologies, but to the power of the Demidov Empire and the incredible endurance of the Russian worker. Everything falls into place. There is a client, there are builders, and there is a clear utilitarian purpose. This version dominated for many years, but one only needs to ask a few inconvenient questions, and the entire neat theory begins to fall apart like a house of cards. The moment we step away from convenient historical frameworks and begin to analyze the Chusavoya Wall from the perspective of engineering, physics, and basic logic, the neat official version begins to fall apart at the seams. It runs into three fundamental problems, three impossibilities, that 18th century technology simply cannot explain. The first and most obvious problem is the weight and size of the blocks. We are not talking about decorative stones, but true megaliths. The weight of each is measured in tons, with some specimens estimated to exceed 10 tons. Now, let's transport ourselves to the Ural wilderness of the 1720s. What technologies were available to the builders? At best, they had primitive wooden winches, systems of pulleys and levers, and the pulling power of horses and the immense physical strain of hundreds of men. Yes, in the early 18th century, Russia knew how to build stone structures, sluices, and dams, but they used entirely different materials and methods. The foundation was small rubble stone, brick, and wood, held together by lime mortar. These were materials that could be handled by hand or with simple lifting devices. Working with multi-ton monoliths is a task of a completely different order of complexity. It's one thing to drag such a block up an earthen ramp. It's another entirely to place it carefully and precisely into a complex polygonal structure where the slightest deviation is unacceptable. Even today, such operations require heavy crane equipment and precise calculations. In the Ural taiga of that time, there were no mechanisms capable of handling such weights. All known structures from the Demidov era that have survived to this day confirm this. They are made of wood or small stones with mortar. Nowhere, at any of the numerous other Demidov factories, do we find anything even remotely resembling the megalithic masonry of Chusavoya. This wall is an absolute technological anomaly for its supposed time. The second, even more complex problem is the stone processing and the precision of the fit. The official version about the practicality of using unprocessed boulders does not stand up to scrutiny. In reality, polygonal masonry is one of the most labor-intensive and difficult construction techniques in history. It is far easier and faster to hew stones into standard rectangular blocks and lay them in even rows, filling the joints with mortar. Mortar forgives any irregularities and errors. Polygonal masonry, on the contrary, requires absolute, jeweler-like precision. To fit two multi-ton blocks with complex, multifaceted surfaces, builders would have had to lift and lower the top stone dozens of times, mark the points of contact, remove it, grind off millimeter-thin layers of super hard granite, and then repeat the entire process. And this for each of the hundreds of joints. This is not efficiency. It is a colossal, almost unimaginable amount of labor for the 18th century. Moreover, the surfaces of the stones show almost no obvious traces of the manual processing typical of that time. Deep chisel marks or gouges from lifting hooks. The surfaces appear smooth and precise, as if they were cut or polished using unknown tools. This detail has led some researchers to hypothesize about lost technologies that mainstream science refuses to consider. And finally, the third and perhaps most insurmountable problem: logistics. Geological studies have confirmed that the wall is built of granite, but there are no deposits of this rock in the vicinity of Chusavoy. The nearest granite outcrops are a significant distance away. This means that thousands of tons of stone had to be quarried first and then transported to the construction site. Imagine this task. The early 18th century, the deep Ural taiga, a complete lack of roads. Transporting a 10-ton block over rough terrain would be a massive special operation. It would require the creation of giant sleds, pulled by dozens of horses or oxen. Such a convoy could only move in winter, over frozen ground and rivers. It would have been a project spanning years, demanding incredible resources. And where is the evidence of this titanic effort? Where is the abandoned quarry from which these thousands of tons of granite were taken? Such a quarry could not have vanished without a trace. It would be a giant scar on the face of the earth, visible even today. But no suitable quarry has ever been found in the region. But even if we assume that the Demidovs somehow miraculously solved all these technical problems, another, even more critical question arises. Why? Even if we momentarily concede that the Demidov industrialists somehow solved all the technological puzzles of transporting and processing multi-ton granite blocks, we face an even more fundamental and inconvenient question. Why? If the technology defies the laws of physics of that era, the logic of this construction defies common sense. To understand the full absurdity of the situation, we need to see it through the eyes of the Demidovs themselves. They were not pharaohs building tombs for eternity, nor emperors erecting palaces to display their greatness. They were men of business, pragmatists to their very core, for whom every penny invested had to turn a profit. Their empire was built on cold calculation, benefit, and expediency. And it is within this framework that we must evaluate the Chusavoya Wall project. The first thing to understand is that the factory in the village of Chusavoya was far from the flagship of the Demidov industrial empire. On the contrary, it was one of their smallest and most secondary enterprises, a peripheral asset. The main production capacities and financial flows were concentrated in other, much larger plants. Now, imagine the manager of this modest factory coming to Demidov with the following proposal. For our small pier, we need to build a retaining wall. To do this, we will find a granite quarry hundreds of miles away, organize the extraction of thousands of tons of stone, build winter roads through the taiga to transport 10-ton blocks, and employ hundreds, if not thousands of workers for several years of hard labor to assemble these blocks with jeweler-like precision using an unknown technology. Any sensible industrialist hearing such a proposal would have thought it was madness. The costs of such a construction would not have just been high. They would have been colossal, astronomical, and completely disproportionate to the utilitarian function the wall was meant to serve. Why invest a fortune in a magnificent, practically eternal megalithic structure for a secondary enterprise? There were dozens of simpler, cheaper, and perfectly effective alternatives that fully corresponded to the level of hydraulic engineering knowledge of the time. Wooden cribs filled with stone, or simple rubble masonry with mortar would have done the job perfectly, serving faithfully for decades. This would have been tens, if not hundreds of times cheaper, faster, and would not have required any advanced technology. In this context, the choice of polygonal masonry using imported granite is an economic absurdity, a luxury bordering on madness. But the most crucial point lies elsewhere. If we assume that the Demidovs did possess this unique construction technology for creating virtually eternal structures, why did they use it only once for such an insignificant object? Possessing such a fantastic and reliable technology, why didn't they build the factory itself with the same giant blocks? The blast furnaces, the warehouses for finished products, the factory buildings. These were the heart of the enterprise, its main asset. It would have been logical to protect them first, building them to last for centuries. But this was not done. All other factory buildings in Chusavoy were made of wood or small stone and have long since fallen into ruin. And only the modest pier wall stands, almost untouched by time, as if mocking its supposed creators and their lack of logic. This anomaly has no rational explanation. No practical owner builds a platinum fence around a wooden shed. Neither logic nor technology fits the official version. But the most devastating blow comes from the creators of the factory themselves, their own documents. The technological inconsistencies and economic absurdity of the official version are weighty arguments based on logic and analysis, but they still remain in the realm of conjecture. However, there is evidence of a different kind, direct, documented, and virtually irrefutable. It is a silent but eloquent witness from the past, which deals the most devastating blow to the conventional theory. And that witness is the factory creator's own blueprints and plans. In the archives in the local museum, documents from that era are preserved, including a detailed plan of the Demidov factory dated 1735. This is not just a schematic sketch, but a full-fledged engineering document drawn up only a few years after the supposed construction of the wall. On the time-yellowed sheets, all the elements of this industrial organism are drawn with calligraphic precision. We see the wooden dam that blocked the river, the complex system of sluices regulating the water flow to the wheels, the factory buildings themselves, the hammer mills, warehouses, workers' huts. The entire infrastructure of the enterprise is presented with meticulous detail. Cartographers and engineers of that time strove for maximum accuracy, as the operation of the entire complex factory mechanism depended on these plans. And here, while carefully studying these detailed drawings, we encounter a stunning fact, a fact that turns everything upside down. Among this scrupulous listing of dams, sluices, and wooden buildings, we do not find the most important, most monumental, and most impressive structure of the entire complex. On the 1735 plan, as on other maps of that period, the enormous stone wall, built of multi-ton granite blocks, is simply not there. The depth of this paradox must be understood. Imagine an engineer drawing up a detailed plan of a city, but forgetting to include the Kremlin. Or a cartographer mapping Giza, but ignoring the pyramids. It's impossible. The wall in Chusavoya, had it been built by the Demidovs, would have been not just a support structure, but the most capital, expensive, and durable object of the entire factory infrastructure. It would have been a point of pride, a symbol of power and solidity, the first thing any engineer would have painstakingly included in the drawing. But it is not there. The map shows a riverbank, but not a monumental embankment. The silence of these old maps is deafening. It leaves the official version in ruins. If the wall was built in the 1720s, why was it not depicted on the master plan just a few years later? This could not have been an accidental error or oversight. The absence of such an object on an engineering document can mean only one thing. At the time the drawing was made, this wall, in the form the Demidovs would have built it, did not exist. Then how can we explain its presence today? The answer is obvious, and it is both simple and incredible. The Demidovs did not build this wall. They found it. Perhaps upon arriving at the site to establish a new factory, they discovered an ancient structure, already partially buried and hidden by vegetation. As pragmatic industrialists, they did not trouble themselves with questions of its origin. They saw in it a perfect, ready-made foundation for their pier, strong, reliable, and requiring no expense. They simply cleared it, perhaps added to or reinforced it in places, and integrated it into their industrial landscape. In this case, everything falls into place. The technological anomaly is explained. They didn't need the technology to build it. The economic irrationality is explained. They got it for free. And most importantly, its absence on the plans is explained. Why would you draw an object on your own blueprints that you did not create, that was there before you, and was perceived as part of the natural landscape, like an ancient cliff face? So, if the Demidovs did not build the wall, then who did? Here we step beyond the bounds of conventional history and see the traces of something far more ancient and global. When historical documents are silent and logic reaches a dead end, we must let the primary witnesses speak, the stones themselves. And the granite blocks of the Chusavoya Wall tell a story that is far more ancient and amazing than one can imagine. Their surface, their shape, their internal structure hold irrefutable clues pointing to a completely different era and entirely different technologies. The first thing that catches the eye upon close inspection is their age. The stones speak the language of erosion, and their story has nothing in common with a mere 3 centuries. We see signs of deep weathering, smoothed edges that have been polished by rain and worn by wind for ages. The surface is covered with a noble patina, a thin film that forms on stone over a very long time through complex chemical and biological processes. In the crevices and on horizontal surfaces, a thick layer of lichen grows, which are known to be some of the slowest growing organisms on the planet and act as a kind of biological clock. Granite is an incredibly durable rock, resistant to decay. To leave such deep scars of time on it requires not centuries, but perhaps millennia of exposure to the elements. The wall looks ancient, organically integrated into the surrounding nature, as if it has always been a part of this landscape. It is partially submerged, covered by a layer of soil and forest debris, which also speaks to its considerable age. If it had really been erected in the 1720s, it would look different. The tool marks would be much clearer, the edges sharper, and its overall condition much fresher. But what we see is a structure that looks like forgotten ruins, not an industrial object from the relatively recent past. But time has left not only marks of aging, but also unique technological fingerprints that completely baffle researchers. In one of the massive blocks, a strange, perfectly round hole was discovered. Its shape and position suggest it was made for a metal pin or clamp connecting it to the adjacent block. And here we encounter a technology that is the hallmark of the most mysterious ancient civilizations, but was completely unknown to Ural builders of the early 18th century. We find this exact same method of joining giant stone blocks with bronze or iron rods sealed with molten metal in Egyptian temples, in Peru's Ollantaytambo, in the Greek Parthenon, and, of course, in the Cyclopean structures of Baalbek. It was a complex and effective technique that gave megalithic structures additional strength and seismic resistance. But how could it have appeared in the Ural taiga? Where could local workers who had barely mastered primitive metallurgy have learned such a technique? How could they have made the tools to drill through super hard granite and create the metal rods of the required quality? This small detail, this single hole, is powerful evidence that the builders of the wall possessed knowledge belonging to a completely different global culture, traces of which we find across the entire planet. And finally, the most astonishing mystery, which brings us to the edge of science fiction, is the complete absence of familiar tool marks. When stone is worked by hand with primitive tools like a chisel and hammer, characteristic marks are inevitably left on the surface: deep grooves, chips, and irregularities. But on many blocks of the Chusavoy Wall, we see something different. Their adjoining surfaces look surprisingly smooth, precise, almost as if they were cast or cut with a laser. This negative evidence, the absence of what should be there, is perhaps the most compelling of all. It suggests that the stones were processed using technologies completely unknown to us. This has led alternative researchers to turn to the ancient legends of Peru and Egypt, which mainstream science dismisses as mere fairy tales. These legends speak of ancient priests or masters who held the secret of softening stone, perhaps with the juice of certain plants or through acoustic vibrations. The stone would temporarily become as plastic as clay, allowing it to be shaped and blocks to be fitted perfectly, which would then harden again to form a monolith. Other hypotheses speak of acoustic levitation, using sound to neutralize gravity and move multi-ton blocks through the air. It sounds like fantasy, but the inexplicable precision and the absence of marks from brute force on the stones in Chusavoy make one wonder, what if there is more truth in ancient myths than we are accustomed to believe? The wall in Chusavoy is not just a mystery. It could be a key to understanding that on the territory of Russia, just as across the entire world, there once existed a single, prehistoric civilization. So what is the wall in Chusavoy? Just an old pier, built by talented but entirely human craftsmen of the 18th century? Or something immeasurably greater? A legacy left to us by those whose names and deeds have been erased from the chronicles. Throughout our investigation, we have seen the pillars supporting the official version crumble one by one. Everything contradicts it, from the laws of physics and engineering logic to economic expediency and, most importantly, the blueprints of its supposed creators. The wall refuses to fit into the cozy and simple picture of the past. It is a foreign element, a technological and chronological paradox. The wall in Chusavoy is a classic out-of-place artifact, an object that should not exist within the accepted historical paradigm. Such finds are easier to ignore or force into the narrow confines of questionable explanations than to admit that our history textbooks may be incomplete or even wrong. It is a silent witness to how much we truly do not know about our own land's past. It stands as a rebuke to our overconfidence, proving that ancient history was far more complex and multifaceted than the linear progression from stone axe to steam engine. Perhaps what we are seeing is not just a pier, but the remains of something much grander. A fragment of an ancient harbor, built on a river route by a civilization for whom the Ural Mountains were not a remote backwater, but an important center? Or part of a defensive fortress that protected an unknown city, long buried under the layers of time. Each of these versions seems fantastic, only until we look at the stones themselves, which, by their appearance and construction technology, confirm that their creators possessed knowledge that we are only beginning to rediscover. It stands as a silent challenge, forcing us to ask the ultimate questions. What else do the ancient Ural Mountains hide in their inaccessible valleys? What secrets does the land we walk on hold? And most importantly, are we ready to hear the answers, even if they completely overturn our entire understanding of history, of our ancestors, and of ourselves? History is not a static collection of dates and facts. It is a living process of discovery, full of blank spots and unsolved mysteries. And the Chusavoy Wall is not the final point of an investigation, but an invitation to look wider, to doubt, to search, and to think for ourselves. Because the greatest discoveries always begin with a simple but bold question. What if everything we've been told is wrong?